Welcome to the Central Seminary Podcast. We're delighted to have you with us today as we discuss biblical and theological issues relating to life and ministry. This podcast is a ministry of Central Baptist Theological Seminary in Plymouth, Minnesota. To learn more about Central Seminary, visit our website at www.centralseminary.edu. My name is Micah, and I'll be your host. Welcome today to the Central Seminary Podcast. We are looking ahead to our McDonald Lectures with Dr. Kyle Dunham, and we have him here to join us on the podcast. Kyle, welcome.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the invitation. It's good to be with you.
We are looking forward to this event, or if you're listening to this after February 11th, looking back at the event of our McDonald Lectures with the title of Finding Wonder in a Fallen World, Deploying Ecclesiastes in a Post-Secular Context on Tuesday, February 11th. And I wanted to ask our guest lecturer, Kyle, a little bit more about Ecclesiastes and to even open a little bit of questions on his work, his commentary work in Ecclesiastes. And I know there's many applications that can take. And so we're going to look ahead to the McDonald Lecture and the resources that we have available. Those will be live streamed. You can register on our website or then look for those resources on our website following it. So as we think about Ecclesiastes, Kyle, you've chosen this title, Finding Wonder in a Fallen World. Is that something that has encapsulated your study? Has that been more of a recent very summarization? I like that summary of the book of Ecclesiastes. How has that come to summarize Ecclesiastes for you?
Yeah, well, we'll probably get into this a little bit, but Ecclesiastes is sort of an interpretive razor's edge in a way, because it's a book that traditionally has led interpreters in one of two directions, either to see the author as a skeptic who is sort of laboring at trying to make sense of a world, but in some extreme cases doing so from almost an unbeliever standpoint. There's even a commentator who at various points would sort of stop his commentary and say, I wish I could, preach the gospel to the author because he really needs to understand who God is, which to me seems a very extreme position for a book that's canonical and divinely inspired, as the New Testament would clearly teach. On the other end are those who tend to view the book more sympathetically or see bright notes within the book. Now, I don't harbor any illusions that this is like a Hallmark movie. I say it's more like Gotham than Mayberry, but at the same time, I think ultimately he's moving us on a trajectory toward finding joy and wonder, finding delight in the gifts that God gives us. And so one of my missions in life over the course of writing this commentary, and I hope, Lord willing, for it to bear fruit down the line, is to recover what I see as the gospel implications of a book that I think has a lot to teach us about our current cultural moment. As I sort of follow some of the cultural trends, but there seems to be something of a cultural moment in which there's a greater openness to various forms of religious commitment and religious faith. There seems to be kind of a move toward looking at the world in a way that moves us a little bit from this ultra-scientific lens and secular lens that's been applied for a while. And I'm seeing this through a variety of sources, but some leading Christian thinkers are also publishing books about finding wonder in the world. And there seems to be some kind of cultural moment that I think Ecclesiastes is uniquely poised to help us with, because what he's essentially saying, to my mind, is I've looked at everything there is under the sun, and in the end, what I conclude is find joy and experience wonder at the goodness of God in his gifts, while also understanding that we are mortal and we are finite. So that's kind of packing a lot in, but he's essentially saying we know we're going to die, we know we have limitations as humans. If we can embrace in the light of those things the good things God has done for us, then that's really the way to live. in a fallen world. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's kind of how I came
Yeah.
up with this idea, and I see the trajectory of the book as finding wonder in a fallen world.
And really, you even summarized your session titles there: post-secularism and the use of Ecclesiastes. Obvious that there is that need and connection, but then the finding wonder in a fallen world, the main theme of Ecclesiastes. And then the third session that you'll do is where do we go from here? Strategies for deploying Ecclesiastes. So I'm interested in that, of some of those strategies, ways that we can apply that. Thinking on your work in Ecclesiastes, how long would you say or that you have been working in the book in both a formal way to teach it? When maybe did you first teach through the book of Ecclesiastes or do some of that work?
Yeah, so I've sort of had some kind of a relationship or commitment to Ecclesiastes probably for 12 to 15 years, I would say. So going back to my own seminary days, having had a class in Ecclesiastes, and that's kind of what started me on some trajectories. My eventual PhD was sort of in a nutshell formulated in a Hebrew exegesis class, as is my interest in Ecclesiastes. And then it was around 2013, I think, that I started to have some conversations about joining a co-author to help with completing the commentary as a co-author. And a lot of things happened over the course of the next decade, and it ended up being a solo project that's kind of in a different venue, but in the end, it's been about 10 years of commentary writing, and so I joke to others that Ecclesiastes prepared me well for the actual process of writing a commentary, because there's a lot of ups and downs and a lot of somewhat bleak days and other joyful days. So I feel as though I've experienced the book myself. So
That's what we're excited about at Central, to welcome you in, somebody that is a scholar in learning the book and processing through it. So we're excited to hear from that, and as well offer those resources to everybody that can access Ecclesiastes. To just look behind a little bit of that work, how would you describe the work that you are doing in Ecclesiastes? You mentioned that some of your spark came through the Hebrew exegesis. So in your study, how accessible is that work going to be? And then maybe just even how you're layering the work that you're preparing for this commentary in Ecclesiastes.
Well, this project is probably a little more on the technical side as compared with some other projects that I'm doing, with the goal that there was to be some measure of exhaustiveness in terms of treating all the different sources. So this commentary probably aims at someone who has familiarity with Hebrew. You don't necessarily need to be well versed in Hebrew, but at least having some familiarity will help you with some of the terms and other things. Otherwise, generally things are explained fairly well, but it's a little bit more on the technical side. The process that I typically go through to do this is I would one of the first things I did was try to develop the structure of the book. Ecclesiastes is notoriously elusive in terms of determining its structure. In fact, there was an article written on it called The Riddle of the Sphinx, and the idea was that it's as enigmatic as the Sphinx in trying to nail down exactly where the author begins and ends sections and all that sort of thing. So I spent perhaps the better part of half a year to a year just wrestling with the structure, came up with a structure, and so then I followed that as my guideline. And what I'll typically do is take a section, and then I'll just wrestle on my own with the Hebrew text. I'll look for literary features and connections. I'll work through each phrase, each word, and I'll just sort of create my own exegetical digest for that section. And then after that, what I'll do is typically read 40 to 50 commentaries on that section. I'll labor to find any journal article or monograph article that's been published about that section. And I usually end up with maybe 70 sources on that passage that I'll look at and compare. And I sort of layer by layer add in, what's the reception history of this? What have other interpreters said? What have I missed as I was going through? Because often I'll come across something and realize I didn't even ask that question, and I should think about it. So it helps me to round out my own understanding of a passage, and then I'll try to sort of put that together. And so that's the process by which it happens. And so some passages have a lot more discussion. Other passages have less discussion. There have been parts of it I've kind of hopscotched around a little bit, and the final components that I've been trying to finish, and I'm really close to the finish line, is in chapter 7. And chapter 7, just to give you an example, has this passage that many call the golden mean: do not be overly righteous, do not be overly wicked. And so that there have been a lot of articles written about that. So I have to just painstakingly kind of work through some of that. And I'm generally trying to read anything in German, French, English, or Spanish. So it's a comprehensive process, and it takes a lot of work, and it certainly makes me appreciative of scholars who have labored before me. And particularly, I think of a guy like Christian Ginsburg in the 19th century, who wrote a phenomenal commentary, and he essentially read everything that was available to him at the time. And I can sort of enter into some of his labors. And so I'm appreciative of those upon whose shoulders I stand, for sure.
Looking at other maybe practical uses of that commentary, what other offshoots might you be? You spoke of the technical use of this commentary. May there be other applications of that? I know you've written for Lexham in their context commentary, but maybe other things that might come from this commentary work?
Yeah, so I have a verbal agreement with Lexham to do something called a research commentary. So it looks at essentially what is scholarship on the book over the past few centuries. So that will be another project down the line. It has spawned several journal articles. So I've written, I don't know, 6 or 7 journal articles on the book of Ecclesiastes that have been published in a variety of places. So those are different things that have come off. What I've also thought that I would like to do, Lord willing, down the line is perhaps streamline it in a more accessible manner. So that's sort of an ultimate aspiration of mine, would be to take what this is as a more technical work and maybe make it a little more accessible, so someone who's not as familiar with the original language would still benefit from the work.
Yeah, thinking of a pastor who's approaching Ecclesiastes, what would be a couple just encouragements as they're approaching the book? Maybe you mentioned even your personal process of coming to the book, but what might you give to a pastor or a teacher that's wanting to present this message? How could they approach the book of Ecclesiastes in the best manner?
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing I would say is I've been somewhat perplexed or concerned about how many evangelical, generally conservative interpreters have embraced a very negative view of the book, seeing Kohelet, the main spokesman in the book, as a skeptic who's jaded about life. He's cynical. He sort of just lives under this dark cloud, and he sees no rays of hope. The perhaps infamous example being the old Schofield Reference Bible that essentially said this is the best humanity can do in their own strength from their own perspective. What I am hoping to take as one of my own legacies, if the Lord permits, is to what I would call recover the canonical stature of the book by, I hope, encouraging others to take a sympathetic or positive view of the book, to see that although he certainly does look into the dark corners of a fallen world, this isn't a Hallmark movie. He's looking at life as it is in a fallen world, which can be tragic, which can be frustrating and vexing. He's certainly not under the illusion that we should put on rose-colored glasses. But at the same time, he's ultimately concluding that in light of all that God has done, in light of God's sovereignty, in light of the fact that we're mortal and finite, the best we can do is to embrace the gifts that he gives us with wisdom and reverence. And so I ultimately think he's telling us God gifts you with a portion. One of the key terms in the book is a Hebrew word that means portion or allotment. And the way that I explain that is that's both a gift and to some degree a limitation. In other words, if you're given an allotment, it is a gift, but it also means you're given that allotment. You're not given more, you're not given less. And so what he seems to be embracing is this idea that God has given us resources and grace. We should embrace and make the best use of it, while also recognizing that we cannot transcend our limitations. I think in our day of social media and other things, this idea has been creeping into our society that I can transcend my body, I can transcend my gender, I can transcend this or that identity. And I think Ecclesiastes is very poignant in saying that that's not the case. We are finite humans, and so we have to live in light of our limitations and embrace the good that God has given us. Otherwise, we will be frustrated. We won't really pursue life with meaning and purpose. And I think that's why so many people are lost today. They haven't really been able to discern, why am I here? What's going on? What's the significance of human life? And I think Ecclesiastes is a treasure trove for answering those kinds of questions.
You've identified even the use of the under the sun phrase as a way that some people limit the perspective of Ecclesiastes. How does even the use of the under the sun phrase, how does that also through the book of Ecclesiastes remind us he's not just looking at everything that a human can have a perspective on, there's also God's perspective of things that comes through the book?
That's a good point. A lot of interpreters who would conclude that he's a jaded skeptic will sometimes resort to that phrase and say, see, this is only an under the sun perspective. I've heard some interpreters say what we need is an above the sun perspective, because Kohelet is just giving us, human life under the sun. It's just human life as construed by humans, apart from the divine perspective. And I would counter that by saying God is mentioned some 3 dozen times in the book. Clearly, it's a theocentric perspective too. I think what he's doing in this phrasing is essentially saying mortal human life as we know it takes place on this sphere, and what he's concerned and wrestling with is, how do we make the most of this brief life that we have, that God has gifted us with? And so how best can we understand God, understand ourselves, and make the most of life under the sun? So it's sort of a technical phrase that actually also occurred in Phoenician and other places to sort of just point to human mortality, the brevity of life, and the opportunity to embrace joy. And he goes from under the sun as one of his favorite phrases to, it's good to see the sun. It's good to experience the blessing of walking in the sun in chapter 11. And so ultimately, even being under the sun can be a source of joy if we rightly relate it to our place in the world and God's purpose in our lives.
You did a session on work, the concept of work through Ecclesiastes. What encouragements for that process? And I love the practicality of thinking through whether that's a theology of work or thinking through the application of that. And this may be some of where you're deploying Ecclesiastes, but how does Ecclesiastes even just help us with the concept of work and the concept of, maybe even to use the word mundane that comes to us in a regular daily life?
That's a good question. I think this is one of his principal questions, because I call it the programmatic question. 1:3 says, what can a person gain from all his labor under the sun? So essentially, that sets the agenda for the book. He's looking at, is there an advantage to human work that outweighs the detriments to human work? And I think what he's essentially saying is work, although originally created according to God's plan to be a good thing, as we see God himself works in Genesis 1 and 2, has been corrupted and made somewhat oppressive, burdened by the sin curse. And so what he's laboring to understand is, in view of the fact we live in a fallen world, how can we capture and use work in a profitable way? And so he has a number of terms that he draws into the equation, one of which is a word that is unique to Ecclesiastes that means to be preoccupied or busy with. And he will say at various points that God has given us work to occupy us or to keep us busy. And so I think what he's saying is you could almost develop a theology of work out of the book of Ecclesiastes, that work can be beneficial because we're laboring to make our lives significant. We're trying to find how can we tap into things that will bring us meaning and purpose and fulfillment. And yet at the same time, work is burdensome. It's difficult. We use the phrase busy work. Sometimes we're bogged down with the details of work and our to-do list, and it becomes somewhat overwhelming. And perhaps it's been exacerbated by living in an age in which there are a legion of distractions that pull our attention in so many ways. And so sometimes we feel like we're on this treadmill of exertion without necessarily accomplishing anything. And he points to this a little bit in that first poem where he talks about, the created order just goes in this constant cycle and it doesn't seem to achieve anything, and that humans can fall prey to the same kind of thing where we're just busy working and never accomplishing anything or never really enjoying what he gives us. He'll get into this in chapters 5 and 6 as well, and talk about these tragic situations where someone has all these resources, but he can't enjoy them because a stranger does, or because he dies before he gets to, or he doesn't leave a legacy. And so he's exploring all these tragedies that could thwart someone from enjoying God's good gifts. So in a nutshell, I would say his theology of work is work can be meaningful. It's difficult and frustrating in a fallen world, but if we recognize that we're working because God has given us an opportunity to achieve certain things and to ultimately serve him in certain ways, that work can be fulfilling, and it can be ultimately an advantage to us. So this is where some interpreters differ. Does he say that there's an advantage in work? My answer is he doesn't say there's an ultimate advantage in work. In other words, we can't ultimately solve the problems of the fallen world, but we can, within our limited sphere, achieve things that bring us meaning and fulfillment and bring God honor and glory.
Amen. In thinking through some of the ways that you have seen Ecclesiastes presented, you talk about the scholars that you turn to, maybe other commentaries. What maybe for preaching applications have you seen? We know the Book of Romans preached for 8 years. I don't know if you'd preach for 8 years in Ecclesiastes, but what might be some possible lengths that you have seen the Book of Ecclesiastes preached through, or even maybe other ways, maybe a thematic approach to some of the themes in Ecclesiastes?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just got an email this week from a pastor who's looking to preach through the book and sort of asking about preaching sections. So what I would recommend is looking at the outline that I was able to put together for the book. I would say probably maybe 10 to 12 preaching sections would probably work well. You certainly could be more detailed than that and spend a little bit more time. For instance, when I've preached through the book, so I've preached through the book in segments at various churches, and I'll typically try to preach through the whole royal autobiography section. So that runs from 112 to 226 in one sermon. That's a lot of text. So you could break it down to smaller segments. But what that does is it sort of gives you the grand sweep of he's trying to accomplish everything with regard to achievements, personal achievements, with wisdom and knowledge, and with pleasure. And the whole section is very symmetrical in terms of he tries these things and then he recognizes they don't satisfy. And so if you can kind of do that in one fell sweep within the scope of a sermon, that's a good setup then for what follows. And so probably around 12 or so preaching sections I think would be good. And I divide the book into 5 major sections with smaller parts as part of those 5 major sections.
Yeah. Thinking as a parent, bringing the truth of the book, what are some ways to bring that to your children? Or even if thinking of a Sunday school teacher wanted to encourage their class in that, what are some ways as a parent you would open up the book of Ecclesiastes?
What I would, I think, recommend is as you're reading through the book to pay particular attention to his summaries. So there are 7 times where the author will say there is nothing better than to do this. So for instance, at the end of that royal autobiography in 2:24 to 26, there's nothing better than to enjoy what God has given us. And so 7 times he'll pause and summarize what he's been saying and say, in light of what I've been discussing, in light of the observations and reflections I'm offering, our best option, or the most meaningful way we can move forward is to embrace God's gift and his joy through the gifts that he has given us. So that's one recommendation I would make, is to pay special attention to those 7 summaries where he calls us to joy. And then recognize too that I think one of his devices is sometimes he'll come up to the edge of a cliff, as I picture it sometimes, and look over and say, you know what? Life in a fallen world can be extremely difficult, frustrating, tragic, and you might give in to despair. But he never leaps over the cliff. He always sort of pulls himself back and says, even though all these facts are true of a fallen world, there still is this glimmer of hope over here. So I would encourage not to let the negative observations that he makes be the final word, but rather his calls to joy. And ultimately, he ends the book with fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of humanity. This is the way I translate that as sort of like, this is what it means to be a human. The essence of a human is to relate rightly to God by reverencing and obeying his commands, and so living a life of sobriety within the purview he has called us to.
Thinking of some of the popular ways that Ecclesiastes might come, have you seen any ones that catch you? Sometimes, even as an Old Testament professor, I'm certain that you see some of an application, somebody using a verse that is so wildly out of context that from a passage that like, wait a second, that doesn't say what you think it means. Have you seen that done with Ecclesiastes I'm thinking of a popular level. Somebody might think a verse means what they want it to mean, but they're not getting the point there.
I could probably look at several examples. One strain I would say in Ecclesiastes is some have come to the conclusion that Kohelet has just thrown up his hands and completely given up on life. So he does say in one of the early verses, so I came to hate life, or I hated life. But again, I think we have to understand that he tends to use this thesis antithesis methodology, that he'll make a statement and then he'll think about it from a different perspective. So in other words, he'll say something that seems extreme, but at the same time, then he'll counteract it with, yes, but these other things are also true. And so what I sometimes see interpreters doing is they'll read in isolation these extreme statements and not balance it in the light of the whole book. Or what will happen is they'll take the positive verses and they'll read those in the light of the negative verses. And I think what he intends us to do is the other way around, because he'll go through all these difficult sayings, but then in the end, each time it's yet find joy, but still find joy in all these things. And so I think we have to follow him on his journey, not rush him to his conclusion, understand the negative statements in the light of the positive statements, and ultimately see that he's ending on a more hopeful note. And so I think that's important. And in terms of what I'm just studying now, one of the verses that has been a big challenge for interpreters is in chapter 7, verse 16 and 17, where he says, don't be too righteous or wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Don't be too wicked or foolish. Why die before your time? And so there are a variety of opinions on what those mean. There's 4 basic categories, but a lot of interpreters say he's basically saying it doesn't matter how we live because in the end it's not really worth it to be righteous, because it doesn't pay any dividends. And I don't think that's what he's saying. I think rather he's saying if you parade your righteousness and flaunt your wisdom, you'll actually embarrass and humiliate yourself. In other words, he's advising, I think, the way I'm reading it, modesty and temperance. That's self-control and using wisdom in the right way. So in other words, this is a long answer to your question, but I would essentially just say, make sure that you're reading the difficult sayings in light of the whole context, and particularly how he's ending each part of the book, because I think he's intending to move us toward those summary statements.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to these sessions and get to grapple a little bit more with this book. And as we come to that and think through, even this is a summary of what you've been describing, the finding wonder in the fallen world, and maybe even to ask you that as a personal way to conclude our time, what's a way that you have found wonder at the works of God in your life, just maybe a testimony of that. And thank you so much for taking this time to be with us.
Well, I think one of the benefits I've derived from studying the book of Ecclesiastes is just to reinforce in my mind that there's no guarantee that we're going to have a long time of life, that everything, that a perfectly curated social media image might suggest is actually going to transpire. We live in a fallen world in which there are lots of ups and downs. And what Ecclesiastes has helped me to realize is if we live in light of the end, if we live in light of God's sovereignty, I think we can actually derive more joy from each moment than if we just mindlessly sort of get through our lives. It's very easy to fall into the routine of, I just got to get up, I got to go to work, I got to do this, check off these boxes, go home, all that sort of thing. And I think Ecclesiastes calls us to a more reflective and joyful tenor to life. So for me, that's meant, there are some times when it's okay maybe to splurge on something I can enjoy with my wife because God's given us these resources to do that. So of course I'm keeping everything in balance, but understanding that there are certain gifts God gives us in life that we shouldn't be shy to embrace those and to be thankful for those and to live with a posture of reverent gratitude and sober joy, thinking every moment is a gift from God. And so I think this is a wisdom disposition that actually helps to make life even more fulfilling and meaningful.
Amen. Thank you, Kyle, for being with us and to give us a little bit of the summary, a little preview of these sessions, and as well connect us to some. Where would people be looking for some of those commentary works? Again, I know you're in that process and the revisions and all of that. Where might people look when some of those commentaries start to come out?
So this will be published with Lexham Press and Logos Bible software. So there will be an electronic version with Logos as well as a print version with Lexham Press. I don't have a definitive date yet for when that will be available. I'm anticipating probably 2026, depending on the length of the editing process. Those are the ones coming. There are a number of journal articles I've written that are available in different places, but in terms of the finished product on Ecclesiastes, probably 2026 with Lexham Press.
Excellent. Well, we're excited for the McDonald Lectures in Bible and Theology for us to grapple with the book of Ecclesiastes, deploying Ecclesiastes in a post-secular context. For those that are listening to it, you can register for the conference. It will be live streamed, so please join us for that. And as well, look at the videos that we'll have posted following the conference. So Kyle, thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to having you with us. Thanks for listening to the Central Seminary podcast. Our mission at Central Seminary is to assist New Testament churches in equipping spiritual leaders for Christ-exalting biblical ministry. Since its founding in 1956, Central Seminary has sought to provide serious students of God's Word with robust theological education as they prepare for ministry. We have graduates around the world who are serving in countless ways to spread the gospel and proclaim the name of Jesus Christ. Find out more at our website, centralseminary.edu.